Okay, so I should just so I should I'm in, right? All right. So okay. So with that as a segue introduction, I'm grateful for the chance to be here and to talk about some issues that matter to me and that I hope matter to those that are in the audience. Um, I just wanted to do a headshot of myself before I go to screen share for two reasons. One, just to show you that I'm wearing my "We the People" tie, and I assert that I'm wearing pants, but I won't provide any evidence of that. That would be too much information. Um, with that as intro, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully talk about something that is going to be useful. So let's go to full screen and let's go to present. So again, I welcome the invitation from Rich, who put this conference together, to speak here, in part because of my connection to Caitlin Long and the fact that I wanted to support the endeavors that she is pushing. The kinds of legislative efforts that she's made matter to me, and since this was an opportunity to underscore what she's done and all of the activity going on in Wyoming, I was happy to sign up. For those of you that are paying close attention, you'll notice that my talk title is just slightly different than what's listed in the program. In fact, I changed the talk title just about 5 minutes ago. As I was reviewing the talk, I thought, gee, why don't I include uh, the fact that I'm going to talk a little bit about the history as well as the present and the future. And of course, it's trivial to change my document at the last minute because it's a digital record. And in fact, it's impossible for anyone to definitively know whether this has been my talk all along or, that I said a month ago or that I changed just 5 minutes ago. And of course, that's actually the segue into my way of thinking about the blockchain. Namely, it was quite a few years ago where a slimmer and younger version of me was working with Dr. Stuart Haber at part of the old Bell Labs system, Bell Communications Research, and we were deeply concerned about the issue of how to create an immutable digital record. We reasoned that historically, the way to know that records had integrity was you could detect signs of tampering in the medium on which they were embedded. And it became clear to us that in a digital future, the medium would no longer be something that you could count on. And so we needed to make the actual ones and zeros themselves immutable. Uh, many of you probably know the story about the Friendly's restaurant if you've ever heard me speak before, but just for those that are unaware, this is just a kind of historical anecdote that some find interesting. Namely, after Stuart and I worked on this problem for quite a long time, we had kind of a sort of working solution, but it required you to trust someone. And I suggested to Stuart that instead we come up with a solution that required you to trust no one. And eventually Stuart pulled me aside and said, I don't think this can be done. So why don't we make a proof that you have to trust someone in any system? And it was actually in the context of writing out that proof that one day while I was waiting with my wife in line at this local Friendly's restaurant, that I realized the way to trust no one is to trust everyone collectively. And that actually was a major turning point in understanding how to make immutable records. So just thought I'd throw that in just for the fun of it. So, we did a lot of work in those days, but it was really hard to get the message out until the Bitcoin paper came out. And with the publication of the Bitcoin paper, suddenly a much wider audience became aware of the sort of foundation layer that helps to sustain and support what goes on with digital currencies and a host of other things. These, of course, are the citations out of the Bitcoin paper to the work that Dr. Haber and I did. And so I've been thinking a little bit about the audience, and again, I'm trying to speak to a broader audience, including those that don't understand the technology in all of its detail. And so I just want to point out that there has been a continuously operating, what you would call a blockchain, though we didn't call it a blockchain at the time, since 1995, since many, many years before the Bitcoin paper, and it continues to operate to this day. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually show you how the original sort of proto-blockchain operated as a kind of anchor to what I'm going to talk about. And again, as another way of thinking about this, for those that are not so technically inclined, this is an example of a blockchain that predates the work that Dr. Haber and I did by about 500 years. Most of you are familiar with the term indentured servant, but many are not familiar with what an indenture is. This is an indenture from about the 14th century in Europe. And it's called an indenture because this is a contract in triplicate, but it's these wavy lines that lead to it being called an indenture. And I'm wondering if there's someone, do we have the ability of someone in the audience to speak up? Is there someone in the audience that knows why this is called an indenture? What it is about the wavy line? All right. Well, let me answer the question I've posed, either because no one's aware or doesn't want to volunteer, or maybe I've misunderstood and people don't have the ability to raise questions. It's called an indenture because the way it worked. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Well, then let me pivot and just explain this myself, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions, and I can work that out a little later. At any rate, this early blockchain called an indenture, triplicate copies of the contract, and then the contract was torn in as random and as ragged a way as it could be along these lines, and copies distributed to each of the key parties. And the reason for that is if there was ever a dispute, it was possible to bring the different copies back together, and only authentic copies would line up that ragged tear. And in a sense, that's really what the blockchain has done. It's a way to create a digital tear in a record. So we're actually going to build a blockchain live right now amongst all the participants in this group. And each of you are going to function as a node, and each of you is going to receive a copy of the blockchain. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to go to this website, Gazillion. Notice it's spelled with all I's. And when you get to Gazillion, what you'll see is a screen that looks like this. and you shouldn't be able to do anything at it yet until I log in. Okay, so just be patient for a minute. But when you do get to this screen and have a chance to join, what you're going to want to do is choose that lower choice, and you're going to click on Join Blockchain. Just don't try to do it just quite yet, because I have to create the Genesis block. Okay, and you know, I typically try to pick something that's timely for us to make a prediction about. And I was tempted with all of the recent activity in the federal government to think about the election or the Supreme Court, but I just decided, you know, that's just way too divisive. So instead, a little lighter, we're going to each try to predict who's going to win the college football championship. Now, these were the odds as of 2 days ago. Obviously, now that the Mountain West and Wyoming is back in play, I'm sure the odds makers have adjusted accordingly for Wyoming to win the championship. But this is just some context for you to think about what you might want to guess. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, and right up here is where you're going to create your entry into the blockchain. So I'm going to create the Genesis block here. I'll put my name in. I'm going to put my actual email address. And the reason I'm going to do that is if you do that, then you can receive an actual permanent copy of this blockchain afterwards. You will not be spammed, but you can put a fake email address in if you want. At any rate, I'm going to predict that the playoff in college football, I'm going to go with Alabama for the 2020-2021 season. Okay, so there's my entry. Now, immediately once you place your entry, you'll start to see a screen that looks like this. Here's my initial entry, but no blockchain has yet been built because I need multiple parties to join in with me. That's the first one. I also don't have a receipt, but I will shortly as more of you try to join. Are people able to add their entries into the blockchain? Again, what you're going to want to be pressing is this. Anyone able to have success there? Okay, we've got a second person that has placed their entry in. Now, the minimum block size here is 4. So as soon as we get a fourth entry in place, you'll see some activity begin to occur here. There's a third, and wait for that fourth, and then you'll see the blockchain begin to be built. If we need to, what I can do is just add an additional entry automatically. So I've just added some additional entries. Now the blockchain begins to be built. So what's happened? Well, first of all, 4 of you have been joined together. Now there's a Merkle tree that's built. Here's the first entry in the backbone of the blockchain. The other thing that's happened is that you've each received a copy of this blockchain backbone. And now others, these are the ones that I just created at random to place their entries in. And you can see the first link in the chain was built into the second. Now, if I want to make sure that a wide group of people hold my entry, then I request a validation. And let me just make something clear by annotating something on the screen, namely that this record here is private to me. That's private. This record here that goes up to the top is my receipt, and this record here at the top, that's the public part of the blockchain. So the original work that we did was what people would today call a hybrid blockchain. At any rate, I can now request validation from the collective holders of this system. I'm gonna just put that out. So what happens is 3 people get chosen at random to validate that my receipt is valid. A copy of my receipt and my entry is sent to each of them, and they validate it against their private copy of the blockchain. And what we see is that Chris is validated, and if you were to look at Chris's screen, it would point out that he just earned a surety credit for validating the request, his software that he downloaded. Ernest has validated, and Colin we're still waiting on. So Colin's been selected to perform a validation. Colin, if you're listening, you want to press that perform validation button. And he performed it, and as a result, he earned the incentive of a surety credit. Now suppose it's fast forward 4 or 5 months, and the championship has been played, and it turns out that Alabama didn't win. In fact, as I suggested, in a miracle finish, it was actually Wyoming. Okay. And so I still want to win the betting pool. So I just alter my documents slightly, and then I, ask for the system to verify that my document's true. And so now it goes to Kayla, and it goes also to Colin. So Kayla and Colin each get a copy of my receipt that I've modified, that I've tampered with, and they check it against their copy of the blockchain. Well, unfortunately for me at least, the outcome is different. If Kayla and Colin can weigh in, this character that I created, Whitney, has already weighed in and checked my receipt against her copy of the blockchain and says it doesn't validate. She receives credit just for doing the public justice. So if Kayla were to validate, she'd just press here. And again, my fraud would be immediately revealed. So again, this is a little different than perhaps the blockchain that people are, many of the blockchains today in a couple of ways. But in all of its essential features, the integrity of the system is maintained. And obviously with the publication of the Bitcoin paper and the extreme interest in that, we suddenly got lots of over-the-top predictions that this was now a new kind of decentralized living organism. It was going to completely disintermediate not just banks, but even nation states, allow us to reclaim the golden age of the internet, create economic equality, and what list would be complete without world peace thrown in for good measure. It obviously hasn't quite evolved that quickly. And I want to talk about a couple of the reasons for that and offer some advice about how we can accelerate the transition. So as this recent article in Wired magazine indicated.
What did Scott say? What are you talking about?
He's talking about how when he was at Bell Labs, he's one of the creators of
I'm sorry, are we?
Digital
Huh.
Somebody needs to mute, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid someone may need to mute, but I'm just going to just try to talk on. At any rate, it leads me to the kind of message I got from one of my sons, who's an economist, who's quite the blockchain skeptic. And he says, Dad, let me just send you a simplified decision analysis mechanism for deciding which projects would most benefit from a blockchain. And he sent me this. And I'm, of course, not quite as cynical as that, but I do think great care needs to be taken if we're going to realize the promise of the blockchain in deciding how to apply it to particular scenarios. And what I'd like to suggest, first of all, is that the essence of the blockchain is a set of linked records that are widely witnessed, okay? And it's for that reason that I really want to say that the medieval indentures were themselves a kind of blockchain already. You can categorize the hundreds of blockchains that have been built in the ensuing years along these sort of 5 dimensions, and kind of populate that space, whether you're talking about Bitcoin or Ethereum or Algorand or Beefchain or whatever. But they all have those 2 characteristics that I've listed at the top and then vary along this feature set. What I'd really like to spend the balance of the time, though, on is where to go from here. And I think there's a temptation to look at what's going on in other jurisdictions, other nations, and try to raise interest or drive interest by trying to scare people into saying others are getting ahead of us, and we should try to catch up with them or something like that. And I think that's kind of a cheap shot. And it's one reason why I wanted to come to the Wyoming conference, because I like the idea of Wyoming stepping out and trying to lead amongst its peer states. And so I'd like to talk about building blockchain with so-called American characteristics, for those of you that get the reference to our Asian neighbor. And there are 5 things that I'd like to suggest can be done in the here and now to accelerate the blockchain adoption that I think matters. And I'm particularly giving emphasis to some things that can be done at both the state and federal levels, just given the current anxiety many of us have about the kind of difficulty we're having with civic discourse. So the first thing I'd like to suggest is that governments can lead the way simply by creating far more transparent and government records, by allowing citizens themselves to be able to validate any digital government record off of the blockchain. This can be done, of course, still keeping all of those records confidential as the need is justified. But I'm reminded of the newly planted tagline of one of the nation's leading newspapers, the concern that democracy dies in darkness, and the blockchain suitably implemented could make all government record keeping far more transparent and not subject to concerns about conspiracy theory alteration. Most prominent in the midst of that, of course, would be blockchain-backed voting. Now, I'm not necessarily calling here for a fully digital voting system, as there's a myriad of issues here, but it is undeniable that the blockchain can enhance any existing voting system and make it possible for every person to be able to verify that their vote was counted, okay? And in that regard, the blockchain functions as a kind of what I call an inverse panopticon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this was a proposal by an 18th century reformer named Jeremy Bentham for a new way to build prisons. And the idea was that the prisoners would all be here on the outer periphery in their individual cells, and there'd be a single guard here that, since no prisoner knew which way the guard was looking at any one time, that this single guard could keep watch on all the prisoners. Well, the blockchain functions in a sense as the inverse of this. Namely, if we want to keep an eye out on our federal government and state government officials, the blockchain has all of us as witnesses of what they're doing. So even though there may be benefits to centralization for efficiency's sake, they don't need to come at the cost of the ability to consolidate power. They can always be kept on a short leash. Let me go to this one. You know, there's a lot of talk about privacy and the concerns people have for privacy, and whether the blockchain itself almost works against that. And I think the answer is no. I think what people talk about when they say privacy can be fully supported by what the blockchain can do. But I think it's in part because I think privacy itself is not well understood. You know, when you read the original privacy paper by Brandeis himself, he talks about the right to be left alone. And in that regard, it doesn't necessarily have to do with keeping your information anonymous so much as it has to do with keeping people from being unable to capitalize to your detriment on information about you. And what I think the real issue is what people call information asymmetry. And let me just illustrate information asymmetry with one example. Namely, you know, before there was Uber, there were rental cars. And if you traveled someplace, you'd go and get to the airport and you'd have a rental car reservation. Well, I'm a little bit OCD, and I always used to worry about the fact that I would get to the rental car desk at some distant location and have the following scenario play out. Hi there, hi, I'm Scott Stornetta and I have a reservation. And then they say, well, can you give me your confirmation number? And I say, well, it's 123 ABC. And the agent types and types and starts to get a little more and more stressed, and finally says, Dr. Stornetta, I can't find any record of your reservation. Now, that's information asymmetry. I have a confirmation number that I've been relying on since I made the reservation, but they have the master database, and I'm going to lose this interaction. Now, if things were on the blockchain and my reservation was on the blockchain, there would not be any dispute. They would no longer be in a position of asymmetric strength. And I think it's really in that we realize more liberty and justice for all. Let me speak next to devolving power to the community. You know, the Constitution requires us acting collectively to promote the general welfare. But I think that needs to be understood in the context that we can best promote the general welfare if, for all activities that can be handled by citizens amongst themselves, that the government doesn't need to be involved in that. And I think things like beef chain, which in a sense allow an industry to get a crack at trying to regulate themselves by being more transparent, is a great example of how blockchain allows us to devolve power back to the citizens. We should do a thorough review of current government activities and ask how many of them are essential that they have to be done by the government, and how many of them only have to be done by the government in scenarios where you needed a trusted third party to keep track of the records. And for those latter scenarios, we can promote the general welfare by allowing the individual citizens to carry out those tasks rather than having to concentrate power. Finally, I want to speak to the whole issue of digital currencies and all the changes we've seen just recently, for example, with Kraken into the getting a bank charter, and obviously Wyoming being at the forefront of that. There's obviously a need to balance the concern that certain essential functions will be taken away from responsible parties if we just allow a free market of currencies. And I think that there are appropriate ways to deal with that with well thought out legislation. But the idea of just a knee-jerk reaction of trying to stomp out anything that's new in the currency space, I think is a major mistake. And we should have more confidence in the ability of Yankee ingenuity to create great new ways of transferring value that can be an inspiration, rather than concerns that are surfacing in other countries about their systems putting the government in even tighter control of the society. So those are 5 areas where I think practical consensus can be formed, and we can accelerate the ability of the business environment to flourish while preserving the fundamental values that we hold dearest. I want to kind of wax poetic here with a couple of final slides, and then maybe there's time for a question or two. I gave a talk similar to the one I've given today earlier this year on Capitol Hill, and speaking to a number of congressional aides and other legislative players at the federal level. If you think about why the Constitution works, it's in part because it's an immutable record that is widely witnessed. I say immutable, but of course, it's really an append-only record. And in that sense, there's some similarity between the kind of civility and smooth functioning of a democracy that's possible and the supporting role that a blockchain itself can facilitate. It helps to support that kind of an institution. And so maybe I just leave it at this, that what we really have here is putting aside all of the interesting variations, we have a way to create an immutable record with all of the world as witness. Okay? And the real issue is, what are we going to do with it going forward? So I hope that's useful, and be happy to take a question or two if there's some mechanism that we can figure out to make that work. Maybe just the chat. Yeah, again, maybe I'm just, not up to speed enough on the technology, but I'd need someone to tell me what I need to activate on my end, or I'd be happy to just have people post to chat. Yeah, again, if anyone has comments or questions, I'd be happy to have someone ask a question or disagree with me. Happy to have the dialogue. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share. Let me just give it a little bit more, and then if there's no further follow-up, then we may be able to end a little early and have a chance to go take a break. All right, well, I'm gonna call it there unless someone else has something they'd like to add, and wish you well at the rest of the sessions.